Well, I'm going to explain some things to you this morning about women. I'm so glad Tracy's here because we have these conversations almost every day about how little I know about women. I feel a little bit, I don't know if any of you were listening to the debaters yesterday on CBC when, what's his name, John Wing, the comedian, he was assigned the role of arguing that menopause is just as hard for men as it is for women. And he won the debate, which was interesting, but I need to talk about women this morning. And that feels like a dangerous thing for a guy to do who probably doesn't understand all the things that are going on with women. You can see that there's things happening, but we're only catching little bits of it. And men have their own things too. We just don't want to talk about it. That's probably the big difference. But the story of Jesus' birth, this morning we hear the story, part of the story from the Gospel of Luke. And you have to understand that the beginning of any of the Gospels is like an overture. You know, when you go to a musical and they do that big song before that has little bits of all the things that you're going to experience throughout this musical. The beginnings of the stories are like that. Particularly in the case of the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, who are the two Gospels that tell the story of Jesus' actual birth. John doesn't, and neither does Mark. And one of the things you have to notice right away about the overture in the Gospel of Luke is the importance of women. Women with names. And as you read the Gospel, you start to find out that women play a huge role in Luke's telling of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It is women who support the ministry, women who are involved in being healed, who are part of the story. And, you know, to us hearing it these days, that's not terribly remarkable in a church that is 3/4 women. And, you know, we have a sense of the place of women in our faith community. But at the time, it was probably a pretty radical thing. At a time when women were, by and large, understood as property of men. Which is why the Ten Commandments say, you know, don't covet thy neighbor's wife. It doesn't say anything about husbands because it's about property. It's listed with don't covet the neighbor's wife. I think it's home, donkey, you know, livestock, whatever. Like that's the kind of world we're dealing with in this story. And yet Luke, time and time again, references women, particularly in the story of Jesus' birth. Matthew, you don't hear about women, right? In Matthew, the angel comes to Joseph. Joseph hears in a dream that Mary will have a baby. And he's going to, you know, write her off because of the horrible thing that has happened to him. And the angel says, don't worry about it. But it's all about Joseph in Matthew's version of the story. But in Luke, an angel comes to Mary. And the angel says, one of the ways you're going to know that what I'm telling you is true is that Elizabeth, your old kinfolk, who thought she could never have a baby, is going to have one. And so in the part of the story we hear today, Elizabeth hightails it up to Elizabeth and Zechariah's place to see if what happens is true. And Elizabeth says, the child within me jumped with joy when we heard your voice at the door. Something amazing occurred in that moment. They have some things in common, these two women. One of them is shame. And you cannot underestimate the power of shame and honor in the ancient culture. We really don't have a very good understanding of it. The closest we can come is the way we are scandalized and amazed by what are sometimes called honor killings. Some fundamentalist cultures who believe that if a woman is engaged in an infidelity, even if she's raped, that somehow it is her fault. That's the kind of culture that Jesus was born into. One where shame was so powerful. And if you don't understand the power of shame and honor, it's impossible to read the Gospels Because when you get to the story of someone banging at the door at night looking for food, the issue is about the shame of not providing hospitality. And how do we call one another to honor? And so Elizabeth has lived for a long time with the shame of not being able to bear a child to her husband, the priest, Zechariah. And she would be understood, it will be understood as her fault. Biological understanding was the man had it, he gave it to her, and she had to take care of it. And she failed to do that. And so it will be a huge shame on her as a woman not to be able to bear a child. And of course, Mary's shame is that she was not yet married, and she was going to have a child. And so these two women greeting one another in the midst of their shame are filled with joy. There's something unreasonably, outrageously joyful about their greeting, given that they are women who have been shamed in their culture so profoundly. And in her culture, more importantly, their husbands had been shamed by them. And yet they have this kind of conspiracy of joy going on in the middle of that tells us something about what is coming in the birth of Jesus. The kind of liberation from all of those things that keep our spirits crushed in the birth of this one who is to come. The other thing they have in common is power. And we don't usually think of them as powerful, but they are powerful women. Once when I was a little boy, I was sitting on the curb and I saw one of my neighbor's kids get hit by a car. The car was on top of him and he was underneath it. And three women from the neighborhood went running, banging on each other's doors and came out and they lifted the front of the car up. Well, one scooped the little boy out from underneath and took him to the hospital. And I remember sitting there, and I came in, I told my mom, oh yeah, Mrs. French just lifted the front of the car. I was a bad little liar, I got to tell you. But this was true. I was saying, no, they took him to the hospital. Now, the car had not still been out front. If the driver, it was a taxi that hit him. If he hadn't still been there, they took his car. He was standing there bewildered by the whole thing. But it's not that kind of power quite that Elizabeth and Mary have. See, we often think of Mary as this kind of demure, she's always painted in blue robes, kind of like a princess or something. I think you'd probably be closer if you could think of the radical feminist rock band from Russia, whose name, because it might bother you, I won't say in church. But it's Somebody Riot. And you need to think of someone far more radical. We read her words, her song there at the beginning, and we don't really pay attention that well to it. But she's singing a song about bringing down the powerful, raising up the poor, liberating prisoners. It's not a tender, gentle woman we're talking about here. We're talking about a young woman who has a fire in her. But it's a fire that comes from wisdom about using that from a place of powerlessness. She is not a powerful woman in the sense of having authority or having physical strength. She's a woman who somehow through her experience of oppression and shame, poverty, remember where they spend her birth night, comes to power. You might do better to think of Chief Teresa Spence, who has come from Attawapiskat and places where there is great poverty, great powerlessness, and a sense of that. And yet she has this sense in herself that I can speak from that place in ways you cannot rob me of. It was so inspiring to me earlier in this week when we were hearing from the Minister of Northern Affairs saying, well, I've been trying to talk to her and she won't. But see, she understands treaty in a way that the Minister of Northern Affairs does not. Her people did not make a deal with some flunky minister of the Canadian government. Her people made a deal with the Queen of England. And she wants to talk to the Queen's representatives, Stephen Harper and the Governor General. She's not going to talk with other people. That's not what it's about. It's nation to nation. She understands that. And from her place of powerlessness, she's raising a great wave of power. From her place of saying, I will die of hunger before I submit to this, there is a power rising up that we as non-Aboriginal people need to pay attention to, because we're signatories on that treaty too. We're half of the equation, and we need to honor it. Honor being something that we have not got a lot of in our culture the way it was in the time of Jesus. So I wouldn't dare say a lot more about women this morning. But I will say that one of the things we need to watch for as we move through the gospel, particularly of Luke, is the importance of women in that. Women who defy the restrictions of shame. Women who speak from a place of powerlessness that inspires a radical kind of nonviolent power to rise up. It's an important part of the overture of the Gospel of Luke. And as with all aspects of the gospel, we are invited to consider how we will be part of that story, where we will find ourselves in that story. And I wanted to close with just a brief quote from Jan Richardson. She's an American artist and writer. I had the privilege of meeting her a few years ago, and we had a wonderful conversation. But she talks about the choice of being part of the story of the birth. And it's a choice that each one of us needs to make every day. Whether or not we have ever experienced physical pregnancy, guys, and some women, God calls us to give birth to the holy in our lives. Therefore, we share in Mary's sacred creativity. Like Mary, God invites us to be co-creators as we continually seek to bring Christ into the world. God invites us, and like Mary, we choose. The call to bear Christ in us does not ask for passive acceptance, for passivity will not provide the strength to survive the birth. The call does not demand conformity or unquestioning submissiveness, because, as Mary discovered, agreeing to bear the Christ child often requires stepping outside of social boundaries and asking, how can this be? In the shadows of Mary's assent to let it be lies the possibility that she, or we, can choose not to be. God leaves that choosing to us. Amen.